Welcome to the A.R. Bernard Show. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We have two very special guests, Pastor John Carter, who will be joining us to talk about religion and politics. But first, I'm thrilled to welcome Sophia Nelson. She is a highly respected journalist and political commentator, regularly appearing on CNN and MSNBC, and contributing to the Washington Post and USA Today. A Pulitzer Prize-nominated author, she was named one of the most influential women leaders in the world by The Guardian in 2018. A longtime member of the Republican Party, Nelson was compelled to found the PAC Childless Chicks for Harris in response to the Trump-Vance presidential ticket. Please welcome my first guest today, Sophia Nelson.
Thank you for having me, Pastor Bernard.
My pleasure. And can I call you Sophia? Is that okay?
Of course you can. Of course you can.
Excellent. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, Republican. You identify as a Republican, and I have a former history with that as well. Why the Republican Party?
So I no longer identify with the Republican Party and have not since Trump was elected in 2016. And I am a never Trumper, but I can certainly talk about why I used to be a Republican like yourself. Free markets, family values, more evangelical centered people would be attracted to the party of family values, if you will. The reproductive choice issues, all of those issues are what attracted me to the party when I was a younger woman and met Jack Kemp, who was my mentor, a Republican from New York, former football player. Everybody loved him, happy warrior, conservative, but very well liked in the Black community, as you know, and respected because he outreached and he understood the issues that affect us all. So I could no longer be a Republican because of what Donald Trump represents. And that was just not acceptable to me in any form or fashion as a Christian, first and foremost.
But did it begin with Donald Trump, or does it go back before Donald Trump, quite some time before Donald Trump? Because when I think about the Republican Party, and I was a Republican, I'm now an independent, but for the same reasons that you listed. These conservative social values were important to me. Free enterprise is important to me. Limited government, limited taxation. I mean, the basic things that would attract us. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And for the most part, persons of color, African Americans primarily, identified with that party of Lincoln. But then something shifted, and I would place some of that around the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and specifically the Southern strategy. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, my grandparents, my mother's parents were Eisenhower Republicans, and if you go all the way up until about 1960, the Republican Party always won the majority of Black votes, and John F. Kennedy was really where things began to turn, historically speaking, from the Civil Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. As we know, Democrats were the party that was the segregation party. The Klan was founded from Democrat members in the South, those Confederates, et cetera, who had lost the Civil War. You go all the way through to President Eisenhower and Little Rock 9 in 1957, and you get to 1960, and a young John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert cut a deal to get Martin Luther King out of jail when he's in Birmingham. And Daddy King, who was a big Republican, endorsed John F. Kennedy and said, if that man's going to help my son, he's going to get my vote. And there was a shift. John F. Kennedy carried the Black vote in 60, but Nixon still got a very healthy share, probably about 40% would have been my guess. And then when you get to 64, you have Barry Goldwater, Lyndon Johnson is super popular. Kennedy has been assassinated. You go to 68, and then, of course, Nixon wins on a law and order Southern strategy, if you will, of really figuring out how to take those Dixiecrats who were disaffected by the civil rights movement, right, and didn't like that their party was becoming the Black civil rights party. They became Republicans. So the interesting thing is, Pastor, when you fast forward to present day 2024, the parties have absolutely switched identities. They flipped. So the Republican Party of the 1860s, the anti-abolition, anti-slavery party led by Lincoln, the radical Republicans of the 1860s, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution, all of that great history of Thaddeus Stevens and others gone now, erased. And so you now have the parties having flipped identity. So yes, there was a problem long before Trump, but Trumpism is something very different than even the Southern strategy, right? And it's darker. It has brought out nastiness that I've never seen in our politics. The vulgarities being expressed against Vice President Harris are upsetting to me as a woman of color, and as a sorority sister of hers. And I fear it's going to get a lot worse.
A sorority sister in an HSBCU context. But let me just go back to the Southern strategy, because some of our viewers, our listeners, may not be familiar with the Southern strategy beyond the things that you mentioned. This was a specific reaction and response to the civil rights movement. That's why it's funny when you hear Donald Trump talk about he's the best thing that ever happened to the Black community. How do you compare whatever he's done to Johnson's support and signing of, number one, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and of course the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that set up an environment for the 1967 Loving versus Virginia, abolishing the one-drop rule, which you're familiar with. But the Southern strategy was the Republican Party going after the white vote in the South by becoming anti-civil rights, anti-integration, pushing back against these things and really pushing segregation. How is it that with this and behind George Wallace, of course, at the time, how is it that Blacks continued in the Republican Party and didn't fully abandon the Republican Party to switch sides with the Democrats?
I think like anything else in our lives, you know this well as a pastor, if you're raised in a Catholic household, you become a Catholic, Baptist, a Baptist, and it's very hard to break those ties. And if you were raised in a Republican household, and like I said, there were a lot of Black Republicans all the way through the 1960s. But as each election showed that the parties were changing identities, the Southern strategy became a very cynical way for Nixon, who I don't think ever fully recovered from losing the 1960 election. And you see how that played out for him. I think there was a cynicism there that was like, we will pit people against one another. We know that working class whites and Southern whites feel some kind of way about Black progress and affirmative action, which now has turned into this anti-DEI of the 21st century, right? So all of this has come full circle. And I think that Black people in the Republican Party, myself, people like you who had an alliance with issues and policy, thought that the party would at some point, I know I implored them to, people like Michael Steele and others, solve the coming demographic changes. There's no way around the demographics. We're going to catch them. And they caught them in 2024. And they didn't turn and they didn't shift and they didn't open. The Democrats have done a masterful job. Look at their convention. Look at their candidates. Look at their bench. Look at the Republican Party. It's monolithic. It's white. It's heavily male and white, over 50 plus. It's regressive. It's angry. It's against everything and not for something. And I think you're going to see Kamala Harris, I think there's going to be a blue tsunami. I don't just think she's going to win. I think she's going to win big. And I think down ballot, the Democrats are going to have a very good night on November 5th.
The Democratic Party seems to be re-energized, revitalized even, and going through a rebranding, using words like freedom and liberty in new ways. Speak to this rebranding of the Democratic Party behind Kamala Harris.
I think, first of all, and the irony, and as a woman of faith and you as a man of faith, I see God's hand in this. I really do. It's an ironic and interesting turn that 6 weeks ago, when there was the presidential debate and it was Biden versus Trump, and then President Biden had that horrific, disastrous performance, he was the old guy. He was the doddering guy, even though he's only 3 years older than Trump. And you had these two old white men who really nobody wanted either of them. Joe Biden, definitely the better human, the better man, the better statesman, but nobody was happy about their choices. Here comes Kamala Harris through this series of events. Joe steps off the stage, passes the torch. She's 59 years old. She'll be 60 in October, which is young in politics, particularly at the presidential level. And she's fresh. She's a stepmom. She's got married later in life. She's been a very successful woman. She's got a running mate who's your typical high school teacher, football coach, turned congressman and governor, who's very affable and relatable. So they have energized the party and the country, Pastor, because now you have a choice. And it is a stark choice of optimism, freedom, hope, American values versus anger, grievance, curse words, denigration, racism, sexism, misogyny. I could go on and on and on. And I don't think that's really a hard choice, do you? So I think that's the difference.
We talk about woke and how that word has been hijacked by certain individuals, and yet we do need an awakening. Our nation is filled with, specific seasons of awakening to certain things. Do you think that this is an awakening for the Republican Party and an opportunity to rebrand themselves, rethink themselves? Do you think that that's going to come out of this?
I do not. I think that whether he wins or loses, and I'm strongly betting that he loses again handily, I think that he will hang around. I think MAGA, which is, Make America Great Again crowd, which is really Christian nationalism and white nationalism, and I'm just going to call a thing. It is what it is. That is now the core base of the party, which is why you see people like Brian Kemp, Nikki Haley, Glenn Youngkin, and Christian moderate Republicans of the country club Republicans, the Romneys, call it whatever you want. They would have pushed back and ran this guy out of their party, but they don't dare, and they're cowards, and they have aligned themselves with immorality and vileness that none of them practice in their own personal lives or marriages or families, because they feared this base of angry, aggrieved. Literally, January 6, 2021 tells you all you need to know. Trump is actually hosting a fundraiser for those people, Pastor, and calling them patriots. They aren't patriots. They tried to hang the vice president of the United States. They tore down our Capitol. They've gone to prison. They were in a riot that he incited. So this is the difference between the two parties. It's no longer Lincoln's party or Ike's party or Reagan's party. It is now Donald Trump's party, and it is not going away whether he wins or loses. It's just not.
That's interesting that you say that. There are those who say that the Obama administration and his policies fell short. Had it reached blue-collar, white, working-class America, that it would have been quite different. Do you think that the Democratic Party, is realizing that and now reaching out to this segment of the population?
I think the fact that the vice president and her running mate are in southern Georgia tells you all you need to know. Georgia is an important state. I do think they'll be successful there. I also think North Carolina is going to flip back blue. I think she's rebuilding the Obama coalition, and we may even see that map expand, Pastor, because if you're looking at the down ballot races in places like Arizona, for example, Ruben Gallegos is running against Kerry Lake. He's up something like 13 points, which is unbelievable, but she's such a bad candidate. She has alienated those McCain Republicans. And what's happening is you see a realignment of voters, independents and former moderate Republicans like me and you and others who are like, I'm not voting for that kind of foolishness. And if that's the case, I think that you're going to see a shift with those working class whites who many of them will stick with Trump. But there will be a lot who will say, you know what, I'm going to give her a shot and let's see what she can do, because I just can't align with this rancor, crazy name calling stuff I don't want my daughters or my sons to see in their leaders. So I think that Obama built the coalition, as you know, in 2008, which caused him to win states like North Carolina. Indiana, for God's sake, voted for Barack Obama in 2008. It realigned back red, but he brought in new voters. But people also have to remember, Pastor, that President Obama had a Republican Senate. Mitch McConnell announced on the first day of Obama's presidency that everything he did was dead on arrival. He took his Supreme Court nominees that were rightfully his. The things that Mitch McConnell did to this country, particularly as it comes to the courts and Supreme Court, we're paying for it now. We're living with the effects of it now. And so I think to put that on President Obama is partly correct. I think he could have done a better job with building those coalitions and making them last. But I think he found himself in a lot of fights with the Republican Senate and others who just blocked everything he did just because it was him.
Let me ask you a question about, and it's something. Here we are 60 years past Loving versus Virginia, and we're still talking about issues of race. Is there structural racism still in our nation? Because, the Republicans and those who would say, no, we're in a post-racial America, which allows for the dismantling of DEI, which is an extension of affirmative action. Are we still struggling with systemic racism?
So anyone that says that we no longer have racism or prejudice or bigotry or bias and that we're in a post-racial America is clearly not Black or brown in this country. Nothing irks me more, and I talk about this whether it's on television or in my corporate presentations, speaking on global stages. How dare anyone who's never walked in the skin of a Black person in this country or a person of color in this country ever opine on the state of race or race relations in this country? It just makes you ridiculous because you have no clue. And sitting from the vantage point of these men like Bill Ackman, who went after Claudine Gay at Harvard, and you see them fighting things like the Fearless Fund, which was a fund put together for Black women business owners on Wall Street who get no venture capital. White men get 98% of venture capital in this country. And we tried to get some for Black women, and they took it to court and said it was racist against white people. They're turning civil rights laws on their heads. Groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Coalition and all these groups that are being funded by billionaires who, by the way, pay for junkets for our Supreme Court justices to go to Russia and other places. And that's a fact. That's not made up. And, when you boil it down, of course, there's systemic racism. This country started half slave, half free, and slavery lasted over 200 years legalized, and then you had 100 years of Jim Crow. Are you kidding me? You think it's wiped out in 50 years? That's ridiculous.
Project 2025, it has come up again and again. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump tried to distance himself from it, but he failed to do that because in certain conversations that he was having, he pointed to it. How do you speak to this? And I read through the 920 pages, and it is an ideological purging of the American government and the American system. No two ways about it. What do you have to say about Project 2025 and its influence on a potential Trump presidency?
Listen, Donald Trump's running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, wrote the foreword for Project 2025. I don't need to say anything else. And many of the people who wrote positions on whether it was what we do at the State Department, what we do with the Department of Education, what we do at Defense, et cetera, are Heritage Fellows or people that worked in the Trump administration in the previous iteration of it, 2017 through 2021, or there are people who are aligned with this campaign. So it's just ridiculous. Of course, Trump is involved. His fingerprints are all over it, and his people are very involved in it. And again, his running mate wrote the foreword to Project 2025. That tells you everything you need to know.
Do you think that the DNC is going to also consider the charges that have been brought against them, that they've ignored the Black vote, that they've taken the Black vote for granted?
I think that, as we talked about earlier, Pastor, there was a realignment. Black voters don't really have a choice but to align with Democrats and or be independents because the Republicans just have no agenda, no representation for Black issues, Black people, brown people, marginalized people. In fact, they are squarely positioned against those communities. And that's their policy. That's their point of view. That's their perspective. So it's not that Democrats have ignored or taken Black votes for granted. Of course, whenever you have 90% of any community in your column, they're safe for you. You're not going to give them the same love and attention that you do when you're trying to court Hispanics who are still, maybe 65-35 or 70-30 or 60-40, depending on the numbers that you believe. Mm-hmm. So Black folks need a realignment. Black folks need a better policy, I think, footing to force Republicans to say, in a world with demographics of this shape and color in 2024 and beyond, you do need to consider our votes. You do need to talk to our communities. But we don't do that because we're so turned off and offended by what we see coming out of the Republican Party that I think we just sit back and say, yeah, I'm a Democrat or I'm an independent. And, I know that there are some Black men who will support Trump, but I don't have any commentary about that.
One of the things that COVID highlighted was the failure of our institutions, including government, to meet the needs of the people. There is a different relationship between the people and institutions, especially government. Do you think that it's also a wake-up call for the Black community? It's been great that the Democratic Party has championed issues on our behalf, but do we need to discover our own strength? We, the community of color in this country, do we need to discover our own strength and begin to collaborate and no longer allow ourselves to be divided as a community and to understand the strength in collaboration and coming together?
There's no doubt about that. But again, one of my favorite communities is the Jewish community. Not only are they a people who historically, going back to biblical times, have been oppressed and what they're dealing with in Israel and Gaza right now, but they are a community of people that stick together. They support each other's businesses. They invest in each other. They lift each other as they climb. They're a model community for a small minority community of people who have been very successful and very blessed in everything they do because they're very focused on community and collaboration and help. The Black community has not done that in the ways the South Asian community does and other communities do because there's a reason for this, folks. 200 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, 100 years almost, hence that, of dealing with the wealth gap, the housing gap, the economy gap, you can go on and on and on, the debt burdens and how the systemic racism that absolutely exists oppresses and keeps particularly Black communities from being able to do the things that other communities can do much more freely because they have economic power. They have more businesses, they have more people in high places, right? Whether it's in the banking institutions or whatever they might be that can lend. We're still struggling. Seriously, look at the wealth gap, 200 years and it won't be fixed. That's the best economists will tell you. That's just, I don't know how you catch up, Pastor Bernard, when the odds are stacked against you like that.
I can have a degree of understanding when it comes to the white community feeling that they're being marginalized. The very things that they perpetrated on communities of color throughout the history of American society, they are now faced with. They are now experiencing the reality of a changing America, a very pluralistic and somewhat secularizing American society. Should we have a degree of empathy and understanding for what they're going through now?
No, I think that what we need to do is have courageous conversations and talk about it and draw a very firm line that we don't want to discriminate against anybody. That diversity, equity, and inclusion does not mean white people lose so that Black people or other people can win. It does not mean that at all. The word equity is a word nobody likes unless it is for their community. And again, you see this, let me give you a perfect modern day example of what I call just of the old boys club doing what it does best. First of all, white males make up about 33% of the population in this country, and yet they hold 95% plus of all the power positions, whether it's in corporate America, whether it's in industry, academia, whether it is in, the philanthropy and the arts, whatever sports, you name it, white males still control the power structure, even though they're only 33% of the population. How does that happen? Michelle Obama talked about this. The legacy of whiteness and being white, that's a real thing. And white people don't want to talk about that, Pastor, because it makes them uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about history. They don't want to know about Ruby Bridges. They don't want to know about what happened to the Little Rock Nine, because it makes them uncomfortable and they want to push it into the past without dealing with the absolute advantages they got as a result of others being pushed down. So if we're going to be real in the 21st century and we're going to have these conversations, you look at an example like University of Florida. It's been in the news. Ben Sasse, former U.S. Senator, was appointed by Ron DeSantis to University of Florida presidency. And you look at the grift and the graft that went on there. They retired him out after only, a few years, giving him $1 million a year for the next 4 years as his retirement package. A public university where they cut DEI, where they banned books, where they've gotten rid of African American studies courses. And yet this white man who was a U.S. Senator took care of all of his friends, spent more money than University of Florida ever spent at the presidential level on hiring staff, paying salaries. And now he's getting a $4 or $5 million package to just go away. That stuff happens every day in 2024 America, with white men being the biggest beneficiaries, with white women following in a close second.
That's a great answer. And I love the passion that you have. And I hope that others catch that passion to not continue the Civil War in a different form, but to actually look at how we can build bridges, how we can work together. Because, Jesus said a house divided against itself can't stand. And we're a divided house right now. So we've got to think about what we can do to build those bridges. And there are individuals who are going to have to come to grips with the reality of shifting power and the need to share that power. Thank you for what you do. I've got to have you back. Love this conversation. And there's so much more that we could talk about. And we will see what happens come September. We'll see what happens come November, right?
Hey, Pastor, it's a delight to be with you as always. Thank you for what you do, your voice, your books, your ministry, and that you are, as a minister and pastor, willing to have political conversations, because there is an intersection with our faith and our politics, a big one, particularly in this election cycle. So I thank you for your platform, and your folks can follow me at I am Sophia Nelson on every platform I'm on, and I would love to interact with you.
Excellent. Thank you, dear. God bless.
You too. Bye-bye now.
And you must know by now that I love talking politics. Politics is power. Who's got it? How they're using it? How do they get it? Should they keep it? And who's benefiting most from it? And we're going to talk a bit more of that with our second guest, Pastor John Carter. We've both been paying attention to the role of evangelicals in this election, Bibles in the classroom, and more. Pastor Carter is the founder and senior pastor of Abundant Life Christian Center in Syracuse, New York, and serves on the Governor's Interfaith Advisory Council. He's also the author of the book, The Transformed Life. Discover how to live from the inside out. Welcome, my guest, Pastor John Carter.
Great to be here.
So let's go to 1990.
Okay.
When
getting in the time machine,
we planted, right? I say we because I had the privilege to join you and your lovely wife Lisa, and planted a church in Syracuse, New York, central New York. And you've grown it into an incredible, vibrant congregation, influential in central New York and globally, the work that you've done. But you've grown it over the last several decades from that small fellowship into a racially diverse and ethnically diverse congregation. And in this climate, it has its blessings and its challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about the blessings of growing and pastoring a congregation like that.
You know, pastors, you talk about it, just brings me right back. But before, I was in my 20s, early 20s. I was an associate pastor at a church in my city that was 100% Caucasian church, old school, kind of a evangelical church. And I noticed we were in a community that was diverse. And that diversity wasn't showing up in the church we were at. And so one day, this family walked in, an African-American family, into this church. And I'll never forget, in those days, we sat on the stage and looked out at the people. There were the king's chairs. Yeah. And as we're looking out, the senior pastor and myself, as this lovely African-American woman came in and began to walk down the aisle, and she had a couple of children with her of mixed race. The church members turned and looked and immediately moved in to make sure there was no space for her to sit in. I mean, I could see it all as she walked down the aisle, and then it was just one of the most overt acts of racist thinking that I'd ever seen. I'd never seen it publicly like that. And God just drew my attention to it, and the dear woman finally found a seat. People moved away from her. After the service, no one went to speak to her. I went up and talked with her. And after that, I hate to use the word, it awakened me, but it made me highly aware that in these people who would claim to know Jesus, and I believe they did for many years, that faith had not gotten to their hidden prejudging attitudes and thoughts. And so I began to pray, and I felt the Lord put it on my heart to pioneer a new kind of church in the city that would be a church that would cross geographic, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds, bring people together. And so we started Abundant Life with the blessing of that church. We went out and we started Abundant Life, and then, Pastor, we came to see you, asked you to be our pastor, and Household of Faith was the name of CCC at that time.
In those days, yeah.
And you graciously laid hands on my wife and I. You ordained us and then commissioned us with Dr. Cole to go back and to pioneer the church. So our church started on January 7th, 1990.
Let me ask you a question, because now, right-wing politics is weaponizing the word woke, but you sort of apologetically use the term awaken too, and I think it's because you're conscious of the whole woke idea. But isn't that what it is, an awakening? A sensitivity to a reality that's been right in front of you?
Yeah, the term awaken is a Bible term. The Bible says awake to righteousness and do not sin. And talking to Christians, if you really wake up to who you are in Christ, you'll find it easy not to sin, right? So waking up is something we all do when we get a new revelation, a paradigm shift in our mind. It's been absconded by a particular party's left flank, and to mean something that I think is far beyond what most people would understand as being awakened to something.
That's important.
And so there's a reaction on the other side to the word woke at all, and I get that. But when I say awakened or awoke, I woke up, I'm not using it in the common context vernacular of how it's become a political hot button. We all wake up to things at different times.
And that's a problem.
I woke up to the reality of injustice. I always knew historically about it, but I had never witnessed an overt act of racism in front of us, and it happened in the church.
So it was an awakening that you
It was an
experienced.
awakening. Yeah.
And look, I think about this, and I don't want to stay here for a moment because we are seeing so many words hijacked.
Yes, we are.
And then weaponized.
That's right.
In this culture war that we're in. But when I think about the term woke in the true sense that you're speaking of, awakening, the light goes on, you realize something, you become sensitized to something that you were numb to before. When we look back at the history of America in terms of religion, we've had some 3, some say 4 religious awakenings.
That's right.
Going back to the 1700s. We had awakenings, and these were incidents where the light went on about the moral condition of our society and a need to speak into that society as it progressed.
That's right.
So here we are using the term awakening, right? Yes. Waking up to something.
In the truest sense of what it means.
In the truest sense of what it means, and there's nothing wrong with it.
As a political hammer.
Now it's been hijacked, and that's unfortunate. But you could think in terms of a different kind of congregation. You can think in terms of a racially diverse and ethnically diverse congregation because your context allowed for that.
That's true.
Because there are contexts where it's predominantly white or predominantly black or predominantly Latino or predominantly Asian. Right. And we have to be careful not to judge these congregations because their context doesn't allow for it. Or immigrant populations that tend to attract a specific people group.
Because of culture and language, commonly shared values. Yeah, absolutely.
But your context allowed you to intentionally grow the church in such a way that you would attract a diversity of people.
I would say that's true. I think, but I have to go back to that waking up caused me to pray. And as I prayed and I went into the scripture, I saw in the book of Acts that when this church was born, there were people from every nation under heaven. Scythians and Medes and Parthians and all these different ethnicities. Ethiopians were all present. Then when I went to the book of Revelation and we see this picture of the church gathered in heaven, the church is from every tribe, kindred, and tongue and nation, all praising God with the song "Worthy is the Lamb." I mean, I believe, and so God just birthed in me a passion for a church that would transcend the traditional barriers of race and socioeconomics and geography. So we have, and from the beginning, we have church from the city, church members from the city, from the suburbs, and from the rural and outlying areas. And it's always been this interesting mix. But I would say, Pastor, my further awakening, so to speak, came as I began to the church was in the city. We were attracting a diverse group, racially diverse congregation. We were probably running about maybe 500 people. And the Lord put it on my heart to teach the book of James verse by verse. And he spoke to me and in prayer, and he said, I want you to scrub your politics out of your preaching because there are many children of my children I want you to reach that don't think like you, and you need to understand them so that you can love them. And so I was at that time very entrenched in a particular party that I still agree with a lot of the principles, but I didn't have really any understanding of folks who maybe were Christians and didn't think like me, or people who weren't Christians. I didn't know how to communicate with people across the political divide, especially, and the ethnic divide. So I sat down with some members of my church and started saying, hey, can I have a conversation with you? I had some African-American leaders in our church, and I said, hey, if I ever say anything as a pastor, because I'm aware that I'm Caucasian, that is offensive or is insensitive to what your context is, I want you to talk to me. This is like 1995. And this elder, his name was Jake Tanksley, great guy. He works at a HSBC right now. He spoke to me and he said, Pastor, in the children's room where we had like kids ages, 5th through 9th grade, they all came to worship together. He said, did you ever notice on that wall that you had the great big ocean mural? And we had a muralist come in and draw, because the name of the program was K-Waves, so we put a big ocean front with these waves crashing, and he took a picture of himself and his family playing in the water, and then he painted it on this 70-foot mural for the children's ministry. It was really fantastic. And so this elder said to me, did you ever notice that in our children's ministry, about 40% of the kids are African-American, Latino? I said, yes, I love that. It's so awesome, And he said, well, did you ever notice that in the ocean mural on the wall, all of the children that were playing in the surf are white? I said, no. And he said, that's the problem.
Yeah.
You didn't see it. And it was like something went click. And I realized it's not enough to have an inclusive heart. I have to go beyond that and actually see see color not in a way that's divisive, but in order to really be inclusive and understand, you have to understand the context and the life of that person. And so I just began to take a look at our church. We had, we would give out coloring papers to the kids, and all of the apostles were, Swedish, and I just became aware that these things were happening. I began to talk to a reporter in our church, an African-American woman, and very successful professional. She wrote for USA Today. I said, tell me about your experience. And this is like 95, 96. And I said, have you ever experienced overt, prejudice or racism? And she kind of said, do you really want to know? That's the funny thing. In all these conversations, these folks that I spoke to, especially my African-American members, and I asked them, tell me about their experience. Before they would talk, they would all say, do you really want to know?
Yeah.
And
Are you really concerned?
Yeah. Of course I do. Yeah. But I came to understand that that's because a lot of times people that look like me say things they want to have a communication with cross-culturally, and then when they start hearing about the experience of others, they put up their defenses, right? And so anyway, I became aware of all those things. And in prayer, God began to just deal with me. And so that showed up. I think I would say this: building the diversity in our church came out of God building within me an understanding and an awareness that I didn't have before.
It's obvious that this had to take place inside of you simultaneously with what you were responsible for in leadership. That's a beautiful metaphor, the idea that the children in the classroom were diverse, but the environment was not. And it's important that the environment reflect the diversity of those who are in that environment. That's a beautiful metaphor. But you were willing, you were open to learn, to grow.
Hungry.
What was it about you that gave you that openness? I understand that, you're crediting God for speaking to you and opening your heart. But there had to be something there that allowed for that awakening, for that sensitivity.
I just love. I want to see everyone reached with the good news of Jesus Christ. And I want to see people come together. I personally thrive in environments that are diverse. I love in our church that we have professionals, doctors, and attorneys and others that sit next to moms that are still struggling with public assistance. And I love the fact that we have folks from different backgrounds, and it actually causes us to grow when we learn each other's context and experience.
Now, it sounds wonderful,
yeah,
but it's not that easy.
It is not.
There's a tension between doctrine and practice. So as the nation continued to move in a direction that became politically charged, and we found ourselves in a place of deep divide and polarization. And clearly, it was with the introduction of Donald Trump as a political candidate and the emergence of a voting bloc that saw him as the individual who would champion their cause, champion their vision of America. That had an impact on your congregation. We had conversations, especially during COVID.
Yeah, many.
And so people can't think that it was just a wonderful blend of diversity coming together. There were tensions between those who had one vision of our country and one who had a different experience of that vision.
So when it came to building a ethnically inclusive church that brought people from different backgrounds ethnically together, culturally, color, bring different colors together, that was a certain kind of challenge because you have to talk to people that are in the Caucasian majority and educate them about sensitivity to things that, because of their privilege, aren't necessarily aware of. And that was a challenge, and I felt like we had accomplished that challenge pretty well. We were meeting it well with all kinds of things that we would do. But the most difficult kind of diversity that we had to deal with was not racial or ethnic diversity, it was political diversity. Within my church, there were members of all different ethnicities that were more progressive or voted more Democratic. And they loved Jesus. They loved God's word. I would say they were social conservatives. But when it came to the policies and causes of the Democratic Party, they were not only benefited by them, they promoted them, right? That was their worldview in terms of politics. And then, of course, we had, a lot of Caucasian people, and not all Caucasian, who were very conservative in their politics and felt and as what I saw, not just even before Donald Trump, when President Obama was elected, I began to see this even stronger polarization happening around the season of the elections, both of his elections. And there would be people that would come to me and say, Pastor, you need to endorse President, Obama for re-election, or someone else would say you need to endorse, who was he running against? Well, first McCain and then
John McCain.
Mitt Romney. Yeah. You need to endorse him and tell people to vote. And I always said, that's not my job. My job is to teach God's word and to call people to follow their conscience. And so we're not going to become an act. We care about issues that deal with people, and in that sense, we need to care about politics. But as a church, we're not going to get in bed with a particular political agenda, because whatever you get in bed with, you use them, they'll use you.
It's a two-way street.
It's a two-way street.
It's interesting because we have pastors in this country who, on both sides, Democrats and Republicans,
that's right,
who use their pulpit, feeling it's their responsibility to tell people who to vote for. And we have pastors who, unfortunately, are saying that if you vote for a Democrat, all right, you're not a Christian.
Yeah, they've actually said that. Yeah, you cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat.
And vote Democrat,
and
right.
I've had members of I don't want to be too specific about particular people, but after the last election in 2020, I had members that came up to me that would say, Pastor, I just found out through social media that so-and-so, another member of the church, voted for this guy.
Yeah.
And how could you be a Christian and vote for this guy, right? And I don't know if I can go to church with him. And then I would have somebody come up to me and say, Pastor, I just found out that we have members of our church that, voted for this guy, and I don't know literally on the same day, they would be shocked and offended that somebody could vote for the other side. How could you be a Christian and vote for Donald Trump, given the baggage that,
right.
they were seeing? And how could you be a Christian and vote for Joe Biden, given his policies and their beliefs around that? So it was really tough. And COVID made it just so much more difficult, I think, for pastors everywhere, but pastors of diverse churches, because the polarization of their politics was so strong that it was actually guiding their faith. I would say they entered into a realm where their faith and their politics, there was no light between them. And the problem with that is there's an intolerance that comes. The farther you go to the flanks, the more intolerant you become of others. And as Christians, we're called to preach the gospel to everybody. And as long as we are on one side screaming at the other side, we're never going to have any understanding. It leads to, the kind of spirit of division we see.
How do we get there? We look back, and over the last several decades, and I'm going to start with the 70s, because 70s conversions and leaderships were a product of the 60s and that particular spiritual awakening, the Jesus movement, et cetera. And you have some very, very well-known leaders in the charismatic, Pentecostal, evangelical context who, myself included, were product, and yourself included in that as well, who are product of that movement that took place. We had a messianic hope because it was quite apocalyptic.
Right. Return of Jesus.
The 70s was the late great planet Earth.
That's right. Any day Jesus could return.
Yeah. And Jesus was coming in 2 weeks, and we were all preparing for that. Y2K comes, and everybody was thinking this is it, right? And somehow it left us at a place where we had to regroup, and the messianic hope shifted to a political hope. looking not for necessarily the return of Jesus, but the emergence of a political Messiah.
Yeah.
And that began to affect us in ways that, we were not paying attention to. That began in the 2000s. That's my, take on this, and began to infiltrate the churches. So was it a disruption for you? Because you had a wonderful congregation, built a great community, people were working together, but were these things sort of suppressed or not necessary to be spoken of, and then the political climate, brought it out?
Every election season at our church is a little bit of a tense season when there's a presidential election, because we have people that are active politically on both sides and have very strong views.
Okay.
But it just continued to grow, and 2016 and 2020 was at an apex. And so I responded to it by teaching about the importance of including people and having conversations with people who didn't think like you or look like you, and understanding, rather than yelling, this is what you think and it's wrong, understanding why they think that way and respecting their intelligence. But what had happened is, I would say that our members' favorite news organization was telling them how to think more than Scripture. On both sides.
Yeah.
So they had so fused their political activism with their faith that they began to act in ungodly ways. And I went right to the New Testament. What does the New Testament say about our attitude towards governing authority? You've got Romans 13, you've got 1 Peter chapter 3, obey, submit, honor the governing authorities. Peter and Paul are talking about Nero, who was a vicious and immoral man. And they said, honor, respect, obey. There's no scripture that tells us that we're supposed to take over the government. In fact, that whole idea, amillennial, postmillennial, Christianity is going to take over the world and then Jesus is going to return.
Yeah. Wait, you tell me we're not going to get it all right and then invite him back?
No way.
Human nature's still going to get it wrong, right? Look, I don't want to run out of time, but great conversation as well. But you have a podcast, I think. It's called the Shepherd's Network. Is it a podcast?
Shepherd's Network podcast.
Okay.
I actually have it's called the Shepherd's Network. We provide resources. We do a podcast. We're having our first conference in October, Shepherd's Conference. So yeah, it's to help pastors and churches and really help ministers and senior pastors of local churches get the tools they need to thrive.
What challenges are these pastors facing
right now
that you see?
I think that all pastors I know and have spoken to are trying to figure out how church is supposed to look post-COVID, because everything is so different. Many of us saw people that went, they stopped attending during COVID and they were watching online, and many of them are still watching online and still haven't come back to the local church. They got disconnected. A lot of their faithful serving members of their churches stopped serving and didn't come back to serving. So now our churches are being filled up with a lot of younger people who don't have some of the same cooked-in discipleship qualities and baked-in commitment levels. Yeah. So we're having to figure out how to do ministry to growing numbers of people with less and less, discipled and ready people, trained helpers.
This generation is different.
It is.
This generation, and I'm talking about the young people, and don't get mad at me, folks, but our generation, it was, once you make a commitment to faith, faith became central. And then you organize your lifestyle around the centrality of your faith.
Yes.
But this generation is trying to figure out how to fit faith and church and serving into their lifestyle. So it's like trying to make room for something that should be central to your experience and your commitment. You find that this is what's challenging these pastors most?
I think the generational divide is huge. But I also think that something happened in COVID where people are just thinking differently about their lives. Even all generations are much more slow to commit to something, much more slow to trust. I think institutional trust has been completely eroded over the last 12 years or so. And so, and people are looking for relationship. They're looking for authenticity. You hear that word a lot. You hear, I want to have connection. I want to. They're very much about, I want to feel it. I'm a Gen X boomer on the edge there, and so grew up with rational thinking, right? So if it's how I feel is really not as important as what is true, what is objectively true. And this generation is very much learn to get in touch with what they're feeling and elevate that sometimes beyond what is objectively true. And while I appreciate the fact that they want to be true to themselves, a lot of times I think the challenge is that when what they feel is their true self violates kingdom principles, they don't quite have the internal structures yet to be able to yield to those kingdom principles. But they'll grow up. That's what I like to say.
They'll grow up?
They will. And we're seeing that with the millennials. In our church, it's the millennials now that are getting married, having kids, about 10 years later than we did. But they're building their families, and they're plugging in, and they're moving in that direction. Gen Z, we've got a few, but we're trying to figure out how to activate them.
And that's always a challenge because culture continues to change. Each generation experiences culture differently. And with all of the voices that are speaking into our congregants, the pastor used to be the main voice. No longer.
No longer.
We are one of many, and not sure any longer the degree to which we have influence on our congregants because of all of these competing voices. But what I found with millennials especially, and Gen Z, they really want to be engaged to do something meaningful that has a sense of purpose. Even their giving reflects that, because they don't like giving to the big pot. They want specific issues,
mission-related
that
giving,
they can see, connect with emotionally, and they'll give to that specific thing. So we find that we have to say, hey, we're doing X, Y, Z for this reason, and you can give to it and be involved. So with that reality, it has caused us to take a look at our philanthropic work, what we do for the community, what we do in outreach, our feeding programs, etc. You're doing and have done some incredible philanthropic work. I think about the Blodgett Project that goes back, and Mercy Works. Speak about your philanthropic work.
Well, that's been a major part of our DNA from the beginning, is because I wanted to have a church in the city that was diverse and working with people that were struggling, regardless of ethnicity or background. We very early began setting aside 10% of our offerings and using those to reach people in our community. So we do a lot of projects. We started a second nonprofit called Mercy Works that raises resources for inner city charitable works. We have secured a building we call the Vision Center, where we teach young people about vision and how to develop a vision for their lives that are coming from underserved communities right around us. So we have a huge feeding program. We actually provide food to dozens of local church pantries, as well as other places where the poor receive food and care. And so we actually help distribute that food. So these are just a few of the things that we do in the community and have done for 30 years.
But that's the way to do it, because this generation, when they see you connected to the community and making a difference, and then the community is affected.
That's right.
They're impacted by this brand of Jesus who really cares about them, because that's what people want to know. Appreciate all that you're doing, but what are you doing for us? What are you doing to change our lives, especially the marginalized? It's been great talking to you. I have to ask this question. You're in a unique position as a Caucasian pastor with a diverse congregation. How do other pastors, Caucasian pastors, look at you? With the work that you do and the position that you take on certain issues that may not coincide with their extremism or their worldview?
I think it would depend on the person. I think that, we tend to see in white evangelicalism, they tend to be more conservative and sometimes, very conservative, but on that right side. And then, and I think that sometimes my pastor friends, Caucasian pastor friends, especially if they don't have a lot of political or ethnic diversity in their church, they want to have a diverse church, but they don't understand. I'm not sure they quite understand that to develop that, you have to have something in your heart, and you have to work on understanding people who don't think like you. I think that goes really the root of everything I feel because of what the Lord spoke to me. Scrub your politics out of your preaching. In other words, don't have an agenda. Preach the gospel, love people, and listen to people who don't think like you. And as I did, I just began to. I don't see how you vote. I see you.
As a person, as an individual. Yeah. And yet, politics does come into play.
It is.
Because what happens in politics affects the quality of life of the members of our congregation. But you know what? Let me say I commend you for the courage to take this on, to not be afraid of being marginalized yourself and ostracized by others who feel that you've given in to society, that there can be a balance between moral order, traditional principles, and a rapidly changing culture and society and social norms. A balance between moral order and social justice, I would call it. And you're living that out.
Thank you, Pastor.
Your preaching, your ministry, and the work that you're doing in the community. Pastor John Carter, thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. It's been great.
Pleasure to have you on the program. And thank you for joining us today. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and share. We hope you'll join us again next time right here on the A.R. Bernard Show.